This game between Paul Keres and Mikhail Botvinnik is an example of how to convert a material advantage in endgames with the rooks and knights. Not only black here's up a pawn, he also has some other advantages, such as white has double pawns on the king side, and as a result the h pawn is kind of weak. So the game is quite instructive in that black chooses the correct plan. He doesn't try to passively stick to his material advantage. Instead, he activates his pieces as much as possible, and that is enough for him to win. The game also shows an importance of having an outpost for the knight in such positions. The knight is aiming to come to the c4 square. Black wants to make sure that his king does not become cut off on the 7th rank. So white is anticipating the knight's arrival to c4, and he has prepared the pawn push to e4, in which case it's going to be useful to put pressure on the knight with the rook. The pawn on e3 is the base of white's pawn structure in the center, so black chooses to pick it as the main target, and he's now attacking it with rook to e1, and then he's planning to put the knight on c4 and attack it again, and it's very difficult for white to defend it. So black has intentionally allowed white to take on a7 with check, but in return he gets the e3 pawn, and with that he also gets to attack all the other white pawns because they all become isolated, whereas black gets to keep quite a lot of his pawns connected. Now if black were to exchange with pawns on e4, then this would allow white to simplify the position and also put pressure on d5. So of course black does something else instead. Here the more resilient way was probably to take on d5, and then after knight e3 check, black would take on d5 with the knight, and in the case of the exchange of knights, the rook endgame would be probably winning for black, but it was probably still more resilient than taking on f5, in which case the black king becomes activated. This is an example of great technique. Before taking on h2, black worsens the position of the opponent's king and pushes him as far away from the center as possible first. So here one could consider exchanging on b5 and going to the rook endgame, but Botvinnik simply points out that with the knights on the board the win is easier, and that makes sense because the rook endgames are generally drawish, and it's difficult to avoid a drawish tendency, so it's definitely safer to keep the knights on. With the knights on, the weak pawns are easier to attack, so all that is enough just to, based on common sense, to not exchange on b5. So black has protected the e6 pawn while the d4 pawn is still doomed. And notice that when black takes on d4, that knight is also going to protect the e6 pawn. So black gives up the h7 pawn because he's going to get the pawn on f4, and with two connected extra pawns in the center, he's going to win. With two extra pawns, black won 26 moves later, despite some minor technical difficulties. The only thing he really had to watch out for is that white could try to give up the knight for 2 pawns, and that would lead to a draw. But Botvinnik was careful enough, and that never happened, and he won this very important game.